In my last session, I talked about the scientific revolution that took place after the Protestant Reformation. We looked at that scientific revolution in comparison to medieval science, and we also saw the difference between the Catholic and Protestant Church as how open there was in either side to what was being discovered in the scientific revolution. And it appeared that Protestantism was far more open to it. Now, there were also some concerns that were raised, even by people like Isaac Newton, who gave us the universe of natural laws. Newton himself was concerned that some people might take that concept and say that maybe God really isn't all that necessary. And so we enter into a time period in the next century, I'm actually talking primarily the 18th century now, a time what we call the Age of Enlightenment. And in the Age of Enlightenment, what we see is the whole idea of man's reason coming to the forefront. Notice, it's the age of reason. And it's not that man doesn't have reason. The question is, where do you place man's reason? And what does the Enlightenment do with the scientific revolution that we just talked about? How does it present that scientific revolution? So what we see is that Newton's universe of natural laws did lead some into what we call deism, which is, as I've kind of already mentioned, it's the idea that God was there, God created, God started everything, but He's not really involved in our lives in any way. It's the clockmaker God, the one who winds it all up, starts it up, but then doesn't really care about what happens after that. Now, so we're going to see a number of people during this time period who adopt that particular point of view. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be a dichotomy created, I'm going to call it a false dichotomy of knowledge, between science and religion, that they became separate realms. Over here is religion, you learn those things. Over here is science, the two will never meet. Knowledge on one side, faith on the other, for instance. So we have the beginning of a kind of a bifurcation, like I say, the dichotomy, where a big wall is kind of created between the two things. Now, the scientists of the scientific revolution did not set up any kind of dichotomy, and many of them, as we noted last time, were very interested in simply explaining how God did things. That changes in the Age of Enlightenment. In this age, what we see is a popularization of the scientific revolution, which can be a good thing, certainly, because, who out there is going to take up the Latin book by Newton called Principia? Not too many people are able to do that. So you have to understand where it comes from. But there's going to be, among many people in the Enlightenment, and I hate to cast just a stereotype over everyone, but among many in the Enlightenment, an anti-Christian interpretation of these scientific findings, and an exaltation of what might be called autonomous human reason. See, there's a difference between recognizing that man has the ability to reason given by God, and even the Enlightenment people would say, yeah, that was given by God, but what they do many times is they say it's autonomous, it's separate from this. There's no such thing as revelation from God. Man figures out everything pretty much on his own. His own reason can provide all the answers to things. In trying to discuss what the Enlightenment is all about, there are a number of things to take into consideration. As I've already mentioned, human reason becomes the answer to everything for many people. There's a desire to secularize everything. And again, that dichotomy, there's the sacred over here, there's the secular over there. We also see that in many people's minds, it's the church that's been the main obstacle to progress. And of course, they're looking at what happened with Galileo and the Inquisition and so forth. And so there's some understanding why that happens. But church leaders, according to them, are the great deceivers of humanity. They're foisting on us as a people all kinds of fantasies, the idea of divine revelation and so forth. If you look at the past, they might say the past is full of errors and folly and wrong thinking and tyranny, and that's really what seems to dominate the past. So mankind is needing now to escape from that past. It's time to kind of chart a new course, you might say, for humanity at this point. History gets moved away from just political and military affairs, and I might say and also religious affairs, and it focuses on more social, economic, and cultural issues outside the religious realm, except for maybe to talk about how devastating and how wrong it was. So these are the main things that seem to dominate during the Age of Enlightenment. Now, Voltaire, for instance, we talked about him way back, I think, in the very first session. Voltaire, French philosopher, okay, is considered pretty much the father of Enlightenment philosophers. He was a deist, and he's very embittered against the church. Now, the Catholic Church specifically, in France, of course, there might be valid reasons in many people's minds to not like the church simply because Catholicism pretty much dominates everything. There are priests, there are many bishops quite often that have been corrupt in some way. And so, yeah, there's some bitterness that rises up here. Voltaire shares that. Now, I say Catholic specifically, but he's also against all what he might call revealed religion. So even though there aren't that many Protestants in France, he would be opposed to that as well. And the reason he is so, shall we say, influential is because he's an excellent writer. He's very skillful at satire. And when you can kind of poke fun at something instead of just a frontal attack, you can probably make your case a whole lot better. And that's what Voltaire is able to do. There are other people who are very at the center of this Enlightenment. Denis Diderot, the editor of something called the Encyclopedia, which many people call the Bible of Enlightenment thinkers, came out with many volumes of this. And every Enlightenment individual that he called upon to write on a specific topic would do so then from that particular perspective that I've just mentioned, that really exalts human reason and kind of puts down the whole past and the church and everything to do with revealed religion. And so that's the main essence of this encyclopedia that comes out. There are some people, not everybody's going to say they're atheists, but this guy, Baron d'Holbach, actually promoted atheism. People called him the personal enemy of God. And he wrote a book called The System of Nature, which people referred to as the Bible of Materialism. That's all there is. Everything is pure material. There is no spiritual. Now, we see that in many philosophies today also. The roots of that kind of thing can be found right here. David Hume is a well-known philosopher during this time period. David Hume writes a number of things, but just to kind of summarize some of it here, he basically believes that religious beliefs are the product of fear and habit. You see, in ancient civilizations, people were afraid of all the things that happened, the plagues that they suffer from, the bad weather that destroys the crops, whatever it is, there's a lot of fear. And so therefore, you make up gods to pray to try to get us past those fears. And what is the habit all about? Well, it's passed on from generation to generation. And so, fear and habit are what has created religion. Now, actually, David Hume himself in his lifetime never came out and said, I'm an atheist or anything like that. But writings after he died that were kind of hidden away pretty much make the case that he leaned in that direction. When he wrote an inquiry concerning human understanding in 1748, he talked about how miracles are not rational and therefore they should not be believed. If you read his commentary on miracles, you'll discover that he gives a number of examples of miracles that people say happened. And I found it kind of fascinating how he would talk about the people who actually said this. There were lots of them that saw a certain miracle take place, and how could it be that all of them were wrong about this? And he even says that some of them were the most sincere people that he had met, but at the same time he said, but they never happened. And the rationale, the reason why they didn't happen, he says, because it just goes against reason. And we understand these things better than people used to understand it, and so therefore, since it's contrary to what we believe, it could not have happened. When I first read on miracles, I kind of expected a more sophisticated analysis of that, so I was kind of surprised that it was as simplistic as that, and actually, fairly unconvincing as far as I was concerned. Okay, he also, in talking about man and man's, shall we say, dignity or the value of mankind, in the particular case of suicide, he said, look, is it because, why we should not do suicide? Is it because human life is of such great importance that it is a presumption for human prudence to dispose of it? But the life of a man is of no greater importance to the universe than that of an oyster. Okay, so you compare man and an oyster. The oyster doesn't have what you would call a very high value. Man has no higher value than that, according to David Hume. Now, one of the things that Hume wrote was the history of England. It took 6 volumes. It takes a very critical perspective. It challenges conventional wisdom in many ways. But in there you also find his viewpoint that religion is something that just leads to fanaticism. He's devoted to the empirical method, empiricism, which means that the scientific method, which you just empirically discover things, you don't have anything that you think presumed ahead of time. It all has to be through inductive reasoning. That is the perspective that he does take here. Edward Gibbon, from this time period, wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. What makes this unique? Well, he says that Christianity, in many ways, was responsible for the fall of Rome, because the people were too caught up in spiritual matters. Now, up to that point, that is not the classic understanding. Many people would say, if it weren't for Christianity, Rome might have fallen a whole lot earlier. Gibbon takes the opposite point of view. And he actually writes the first historical work now openly critical of Christian faith. You see, during the Enlightenment era, it's okay now to criticize Christianity. It's something that is no longer, shall we say, sacrosanct as it was in the Middle Ages and during the Reformation, where everybody pretty much had a consensus about the faithfulness of the Christian faith. Here's some quotes from his book. Okay? He says, "The defense of our persons," talking about the Roman Empire, "the defense of our persons and property, they knew not how to reconcile with the patient doctrine," they meaning Christians, "which enjoined an unlimited forgiveness of past injuries, and commanded them to invite the repetition of fresh insults. They refused to take any active part in the civil administration or the military defense of the empire." So he's accusing them of actually kind of withdrawing and not taking part, and therefore by not having influence in the empire in that way, they led to its fall. He goes on to say, "It was impossible that the Christians could assume the character of soldiers, of magistrates, or of princes. This indolent or even criminal disregard to the public welfare," now, criminal disregard, pretty strong term there. "This indolent or even criminal disregard to the public welfare exposed them to the contempt and reproaches of the pagans, who very frequently asked, what must be the fate of the empire, attacked on every side by the barbarians, if all mankind should adopt the pusillanimous sentiments of the new sect?" Okay. Well, how do the Christians respond? He says, "To this insulting question, the Christian apologists returned obscure, ambiguous answers, as they were unwilling to reveal the secret cause of their security, the expectation that before the conversion of mankind was accomplished, war, government, the Roman Empire, the world itself would be no more." So why did they not get involved in things? Everything's coming to an end anyway. Why should we get ourselves involved in the political affairs of our time? That was Gibbon's perspective on that. Now, to try to summarize what this Enlightenment is all about, let me give you some ideas about who man is coming out of the Enlightenment. Not everybody is going to believe all of these. It's a difference of opinion about this, but these are the ones that are kind of dominant during this time period. There are some who believed that man is like a machine. He has no soul, he's just a material being. Now, that is going to be somebody like Baron Dolbach that I just mentioned. There's nothing inside. The spirit does not exist. What you are, what you see is what you are, and that's all you are. Others say moral man. Man is innately good. He's not evil, which again is a contradiction of the biblical concept that man is sinful, where it says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Some people in the Enlightenment would say, no, that's backwards. Man is a good being. Then we have, of course, what we've been talking about all the way through here, rational man, that autonomous human reason is a sufficient guide into all truth. And then there's also perfectible man, the product of your environment. Education will shape the mind. All you have to do is educate people enough, and everything will turn out okay. Put them in the proper schools, give them the proper teaching, they will be what we want them to be. In a sense, it's almost kind of like creating the people in your own image. And they think that through education, just environment, that can potentially create the perfect man. And of course, out of that is going to come the perfect society, right? So those are four different concepts about man coming out of the Enlightenment era. The biblical concept is going to be pretty much set aside during this time. We see that there are, I think, stages of the Enlightenment. This is where I want to make sure we're more nuanced here, because it is easy, very easy to stereotype and cast this broad net and say everybody was like a certain way. But there was a moderate kind, of enlightenment during this period. It reconciled science with the Christian faith that was dominant in America is where you find this. Okay? So I'm a history professor. My main study has been American history, and I can say as I look at this time period in America, let's say the late 18th, early 19th century, I can see this very obviously. They believed in science, they believed in man's ability to discover things and find things, and they believed it came from God. So the early scientific revolution with the scientists there, this is what I see happening in America pretty much during this period. So there's an acceptance of certain aspects of the Enlightenment, and if I had more time, I would go into one type of enlightenment called common sense philosophy that did kind of mirror many concepts within the Christian faith. So there is a moderate kind of enlightenment. But then there's also the skeptical. And of course, that's what I've been kind of concentrating on here. That the people who are unwilling to believe anything that is not proven by science, and of course, science being the inductive approach, where you just experiment and observe and eventually come to conclusions. Unless you can do that, there's nothing to believe. That becomes dominant in many parts of Europe. It's dominant in France, certainly. It's David Hume from Scotland, and we have the same kind of thing happening in Britain during this time period, although I think Britain, like America, had a good amount of moderate enlightenment as well. And then finally, there is the Revolutionary Enlightenment. The belief by some that a secular utopia can be created. All we have to do, set up new governments, set up new institutions, and everything will be just fine. And as an example of this, you could look at the French Revolution. I remember very specifically when I was a college student, and in one of my history classes, I don't know what set this off, but one of the students, a girl who, this is during the time period of the Vietnam War and a lot of protest and don't trust anybody over 30 and things like that. And she made the comment in class that, if we could just get rid of all the institutions, if we could, get rid of all these things that have been created by people, have new institutions, everything would be fine. I rarely spoke during those time periods. I was still rather young in the faith and rather young overall and didn't like to insert myself. But I had to raise my hand on this, and I said, there's only one problem with that. You get rid of all of these institutions and all the things that were set up right now, and you still have the people. And I said, and who created the institutions to begin with? The people did. And so you haven't gotten rid of the problem. There will just be new institutions. There will just be new problems that come to the forefront because the real issue is the people. And it has to do with what people believe, what people do, and basically the sinfulness of mankind. And I kind of waited for some kind of response from the professor for that. All I remember is that the classroom got very, very quiet and very still. And then the professor went on to his next point. It was like I didn't exist. It was like I was totally ignored. So what we see with that is that there are certain tempers of the times. And what I was saying at that point was not really something that anybody was thinking, and they didn't even know how to respond to it. The Enlightenment led to a rejection in a great degree, of Christian faith and the idea of a revelation from God. And it put man at the center of all things. But almost every worldview, every movement has something that comes along and responds to it and goes a different direction. And that's where we'll be in the next session.